The only person who could save the billionaire's dying roses was the very man he never respected. A billionaire thought he was proving a point when he handed his old gardener $8,000 in front of a crowd of wealthy friends. To him, it was nothing more than a joke, a test to see how quickly a poor man would waste an opportunity. But what he didn't know was that the quiet gardener standing in the dirt had spent decades building something invisible: knowledge, patience, and a dream buried deep inside his heart. 1 year later, that same billionaire would walk into a crowded exhibition hall, look up, and find himself staring at a truth he never saw coming. Because sometimes the people we underestimate are the very people preparing to change everything. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why one envelope changed far more than a single life. At 3:47 on a warm Friday afternoon, sunlight spilled across the stone patio behind Richard Whitmore's Beverly Hills estate, turning the swimming pool into a sheet of liquid gold. The laughter started before the envelope ever touched the table. A group of wealthy investors sat beneath a white pergola overlooking the gardens. Crystal glasses clinked. Expensive watches flashed in the sun. Conversations drifted between stock markets, private jets, and vacation homes in Aspen. Not one of them paid much attention to the man working among the rose bushes 20 feet away. Elijah Brooks had been trimming the southern flower beds since sunrise. At 62, he moved more slowly than he once had, but every motion carried the confidence of experience. His dark hands worked carefully around each stem. He never rushed. Plants had taught him long ago that rushing usually caused damage. Sweat darkened the collar of his faded blue workshirt. A pair of worn gardening gloves hung from his back pocket. He was focused on a white rose bush that had been struggling for weeks. Nobody at the table noticed. Nobody except Richard. The billionaire leaned back in his chair and glanced toward Elijah. One of his guests followed his gaze. "How long has that gardener been working here?" the man asked. Richard shrugged. "Years." The answer drew a few chuckles. "Looks like he's been doing it forever." "Probably has," another guest said. More laughter. Elijah heard it. Not clearly, not every word. But enough. After decades of working around wealthy people, he had developed a talent for recognizing the sound of conversations that weren't meant for him. He kept trimming. A few moments later, Richard stood. "Actually," he said, reaching into the pocket of his expensive blazer. "Watch this." His friends looked up. Richard walked inside the house. When he returned, he carried a thick white envelope. He crossed the patio and stopped near the flower bed. Elijah glanced up. For a moment, the garden became completely silent. Even the guests seemed curious. Richard held out the envelope. "Elijah." The older man slowly stood. "Yes, sir?" Richard placed the envelope on the garden table beside him. Inside were $8,000 in cash. Elijah didn't know that yet. He only saw a sealed envelope. Richard smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not an angry smile. Something worse. The smile of a man who was entertaining himself. "There's $8,000 in there." Several guests exchanged looks. Richard continued. "I was telling my friends something." Elijah waited. "I said most people wouldn't know what to do with an opportunity if it landed right in their hands." The group laughed softly. Richard folded his arms. "So here's a test." Elijah looked at the envelope, then at Richard, then back at the envelope. "Take it." The words hung in the air. No explanation, no conditions, just a challenge disguised as generosity. Richard grinned. "Let's see what you do with it." The laughter returned. Not loud, not vicious, but loud enough. Elijah felt every eye on him. For a brief second, old memories surfaced. Teachers who expected less from him. employers who never learned his name, customers who spoke past him instead of to him, people who saw his skin, his age, his clothes, and decided they already knew his story. The feeling passed quickly, because anger had never grown anything. Elijah bent down, picked up the envelope with soil-stained fingers, and said only 4 words. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." That was all. No speech, no defense, no embarrassment, no attempt to prove anything. He simply returned to the roses. The guests seemed disappointed. Perhaps they had expected excitement, maybe gratitude, maybe confusion. Instead, Elijah carefully examined a damaged branch and continued working. Richard stared at him for several seconds, then shook his head and returned to the table. Within minutes, everyone had moved on. The conversation shifted back to business deals and investment portfolios. The envelope was forgotten, at least by them. But as the afternoon shadows stretched across the garden, Elijah felt its weight waiting for him, not in his hands, in his thoughts. At 3 o'clock, he cleaned his tools. At 3:15, he locked the storage shed. At 3:20, he washed his hands at the outdoor faucet. He always did. His late wife had once told him that a man should leave a place better than he found it, even if nobody noticed. Especially if nobody noticed. The envelope remained unopened. At 3:30, he walked toward the massive iron gates of the estate. A security guard nodded. "See you Monday, Elijah. Lord willing." The gates closed behind him. Traffic hummed beyond the walls. Palm trees swayed gently above Rodeo Drive. Luxury cars rolled past. Nobody on the sidewalk knew there was $8,000 tucked inside the old canvas bag hanging from Elijah's shoulder. Nobody knew a billionaire had handed it to him like a joke. Elijah boarded a bus heading south. The neighborhoods changed mile by mile. The mansions disappeared. Then came apartment buildings, auto shops, small churches, corner stores, graffiti-covered walls. By sunset, he stepped off near South Los Angeles. The air smelled different here. Fried food, gasoline, rain trapped somewhere far away. Home. His apartment sat above a laundromat near a busy intersection. The neon sign downstairs flickered on and off. Half the letters no longer worked. He climbed the stairs slowly. His knees ached. His shoulders ached. Most days he ignored both. Inside, the apartment was small but clean. A second-hand couch, a kitchen table, family photos, books, and silence. Marcus wasn't home yet. The 16-year-old was still at a school volunteer program. Elijah set his bag down. The envelope remained untouched. Outside, sirens echoed in the distance. Inside, only the ticking of an old wall clock filled the room. For several minutes, he simply stared at the envelope. $8,000. More money than many people in his neighborhood saw at one time. More money than he had ever been handed in his life. And yet something about it felt heavier than money, because it hadn't been given with respect. It had been given with expectation. Richard Whitmore expected failure, expected waste, expected a story worth laughing about later. Elijah understood that. The question was, what did Elijah expect? He finally reached toward the envelope, then stopped. His hand hovered above it. Instead, he looked toward a small wooden shelf across the room. A faded photograph sat there. A smiling woman. His wife. Gone 7 years now. Beside the photograph rested an old notebook, one he hadn't opened in months. Elijah slowly withdrew his hand from the envelope. The money could wait. For the first time all afternoon, curiosity replaced humiliation. His eyes settled on the notebook, and a thought entered his mind. A thought that would change everything. He wasn't ready to open the envelope yet. Not until he remembered something first. something far more valuable than whatever was inside, something his wife had spent years trying to teach him. As darkness settled outside the apartment window, Elijah walked toward the shelf. The unopened envelope remained on the table behind him. Waiting. Just as the future was waiting, and neither one had revealed itself yet. The apartment was quiet, except for the ticking clock on the wall. Elijah stood in front of the wooden shelf for several seconds before reaching for the notebook. The cover had once been dark blue. Years of handling had faded it into something closer to gray. His thumb brushed across the worn edge. A memory moved through him like a soft wind. Grace. Even after 7 years, he still thought her name before he opened anything that mattered. Outside, a police siren wailed somewhere down the boulevard. Inside, the room felt suspended in time. Elijah carefully opened the notebook. The first page wasn't filled with gardening notes. It wasn't filled with business ideas. It wasn't filled with plans. Instead, there was a photograph taped inside. A younger Elijah stood beside a smiling woman with warm brown eyes. Grace Brooks. The picture had been taken at a county gardening fair almost 20 years earlier. They looked happy. Not wealthy, not successful, just happy. Elijah stared at it for a long moment. Then he smiled. A tired smile. The kind a person wears when the memory hurts and comforts at the same time. The front door suddenly opened. "Grandpa?" Marcus stepped inside carrying a backpack. At 16, he had already grown taller than Elijah. Long legs, athletic shoulders, the same gentle eyes his mother had once had. "You're home." Marcus dropped his backpack beside the couch. "Sorry I'm late. We had a volunteer thing after school." Then he noticed Elijah standing by the shelf. His expression softened immediately. "You okay?" Elijah nodded. "Just thinking." Marcus walked into the kitchen area and opened the refrigerator. There wasn't much inside. A carton of milk, eggs, a few vegetables, leftover soup. The refrigerator hummed louder than it should have. Everything in the apartment was older than it should have been. Marcus grabbed a bottle of water. Only then did he notice the envelope sitting on the table. His eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Elijah glanced over. "Nothing important." Marcus laughed. "If it's sitting in the middle of the table, it's important." The boy walked closer, then stopped. His eyes widened. "Wait." He looked at Elijah. "Did somebody give you money?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. Marcus slowly pulled out a chair. "How much?" The older man sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Elijah finally said it. $8,000. Marcus nearly dropped the water bottle. "What?" His voice echoed through the apartment. 8,000? Elijah nodded. Marcus stared at him, then at the envelope, then back at him again. "Who gave you $8,000? Richard Whitmore." Now Marcus looked even more confused. "The billionaire?" "Yes." "Why?" Elijah leaned back in his chair. A sad smile crossed his face. "That's a good question." The boy waited. Eventually, Elijah told him everything. The garden, the guests, the laughter, the challenge, the joke. As he spoke, Marcus's expression changed. First confusion, then disbelief, then anger. By the time Elijah finished, the teenager was gripping the edge of the table. "That's messed up." Elijah said nothing. "He was making fun of you." "Still nothing. He thinks you're stupid." The old man looked toward the window. The neon sign from the laundromat flickered across the room in soft red flashes. "I know." Marcus shook his head. I would have handed it back. Elijah chuckled quietly. When I was 16, I would have too. What changed? Elijah thought for a moment. Then he looked directly at his grandson. Life. The answer hung between them. Simple. Heavy, true. Marcus looked away first, because he understood exactly what his grandfather meant. Life had changed both of them. After losing his mother, Marcus had learned very young that anger didn't pay rent, pride didn't buy groceries, and sometimes surviving required swallowing things that should never have happened. The room fell quiet again. Eventually, Marcus pointed toward the envelope. So what are you going to do? That question lingered in the air. Elijah glanced at the money, then at the notebook, then back at Marcus. I don't know yet. Marcus frowned. Most people would know. Most people aren't me. That answer earned a small smile. The boy stood and started heating soup on the stove. Outside, darkness settled over South Los Angeles. Traffic lights glowed red and green through the apartment window. A bus hissed to a stop on the corner. Someone laughed in the street below. Life moved forward, as it always did. Later that evening, after dinner, Marcus disappeared into his room to finish homework. Elijah remained at the table, alone. The envelope still unopened. The notebook open beside it. He turned another page, and another, then another. Each page carried pieces of grace, notes written in neat handwriting, plant observations, business ideas, sketches, dreams. One page stopped him completely. At the top, Grace had written, Community Garden Project. Elijah's breathing slowed. Below the title were plans. Not for profit, not for wealth, for people. The project described turning abandoned lots into food gardens for struggling neighborhoods, teaching children how to grow vegetables, helping seniors maintain gardens, providing fresh produce where grocery stores were scarce. Grace had written every detail, every possibility, every hope. Elijah remembered the night she wrote it. She had sat at this same table, talking faster than he could keep up, excited, passionate, certain. She believed gardens could change lives, not because they made money, because they gave people dignity. Back then, Elijah had smiled and listened. They always thought there would be more time. Then cancer arrived, and time disappeared. The notebook trembled slightly in his hands. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost hear her voice again. You know more than you think you do, Elijah. The memory hit harder than he expected. His throat tightened. He looked toward the photograph on the shelf, then toward the envelope. $8,000. The money suddenly felt different. Not like a prize, not like an insult, not even like an opportunity. It felt like a question. What would you do if fear wasn't deciding for you? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Elijah stood. When he opened the door, he found Mrs. Ramirez from downstairs. The elderly woman held a small grocery bag. Sorry to bother you. You never bother me. She smiled. I bought too many oranges. Elijah immediately accepted the bag. You should keep them. I already have enough. That was a lie. Both of them knew it. Mrs. Ramirez lived on a fixed income. She never had enough, yet she always shared. Elijah thanked her anyway. As she turned to leave, she paused. Your grandson helped me carry groceries yesterday. Elijah smiled. Sounds like Marcus. He reminds me of you. The old woman disappeared down the hallway. Elijah closed the door slowly, then looked at the oranges in the bag. Small acts of kindness. They happened every day. Most people never noticed, but they mattered. The thought stayed with him as midnight approached. Eventually, he sat back down at the table. This time, he finally opened the envelope. The cash inside looked unreal beneath the yellow kitchen light. Stacks of bills. Clean, neat, silent. Enough money to pay overdue expenses. Enough money to replace appliances. Enough money to solve temporary problems. But as Elijah stared at it, something unexpected happened. The excitement never came. Instead, another feeling appeared. Clarity. Because the answer had already been sitting beside the money all evening. Inside the notebook. Inside the dream Grace never got to finish. Inside decades of knowledge nobody had ever bothered to ask about. Elijah slowly returned the money to the envelope. Then he opened the notebook again. This time he wasn't looking backward. He was looking forward. Outside, the city lights stretched across South Los Angeles. Inside, an old gardener sat at a small table and began writing something in the margin of a page for the first time in years. One sentence. One idea. One beginning. And when dawn finally arrived, Elijah had made a decision so unexpected that the next morning he would not show up at Richard Whitmore's estate for the first time in years. Instead, he would go somewhere else. Somewhere Grace had once dreamed about. Somewhere that might change everything. And before the sun rose over Beverly Hills, Elijah Brooks already knew exactly where he was going. The alarm clock never had a chance to ring. Elijah was already awake. A pale blue glow crept through the apartment window as the city slowly stirred to life. Somewhere below, a delivery truck rattled down the street. A bus hissed to a stop at the corner. The world was beginning another ordinary day. But for Elijah, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The notebook sat open on the kitchen table. Grace's handwriting filled the pages. Some lines were faded. Some pages were stained with coffee rings and fingerprints. Others looked as if they had been written only yesterday. Elijah ran his hand gently across the paper. For years, the notebook had been a memory. Last night, it had become a map. Marcus shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You've been up all night, haven't you?" Elijah smiled. "Not all night." "That's not an answer." The old man chuckled. Marcus looked at the open notebook, then at the envelope, then back at Elijah. A strange feeling settled in his chest. His grandfather looked different. Not younger, not happier. Just lighter. Like a man carrying something important instead of carrying something heavy. "You figured it out, didn't you?" Marcus asked. Elijah poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "I figured out the first step." Marcus sat down. "What is it?" Elijah turned the notebook toward him. A page near the middle had been folded for years. At the top, Grace had written 3 words. Community Garden Initiative. Beneath the title were pages of notes, sketches, ideas, plans, volunteer programs, seed exchanges, educational workshops, partnerships with schools. Marcus leaned forward. "I've never seen this before. Neither had I." "You never read it?" "I couldn't." Marcus looked up. "Because of Grandma?" Elijah nodded. For a moment, neither spoke. Grief was an old visitor in that apartment. Not loud anymore. Not sharp, but always present. Like a scar that never completely faded. After a while, Marcus pointed at one of the sketches. "What's this?" "A greenhouse." "And this?" "A nursery." The boy frowned. "You and Grandma wanted to build this?" "We talked about it for years." "What happened?" Elijah smiled sadly. "Life happened. cancer, hospital bills, long nights, hard choices, dreams postponed until they quietly disappeared, or so he had believed. Now the dream sat open on the table again, waiting. Marcus looked at the envelope. Maybe it didn't disappear. Elijah followed his gaze. $8,000. Still untouched. Still strange. Still carrying the weight of Richard Whitmore's laughter. Yet somehow the insult mattered less than it had yesterday, because for the first time, Elijah could see something beyond it, a possibility, an opening, a beginning. An hour later, they were driving through South Los Angeles in Marcus's aging pickup truck. The truck belonged to a neighbor who let them borrow it whenever necessary. The engine rattled. The passenger door squeaked, but it moved. And that was enough. Morning sunlight spilled across murals painted on brick walls. Street vendors arranged fruit beneath colorful umbrellas. Children walked toward school. The city felt alive. Elijah directed Marcus through neighborhoods neither of them visited often. Eventually, they turned onto a narrow street behind a church and a community shelter. The shelter sat beside an abandoned lot. At least it looked abandoned. The fence leaned sideways. Weeds stood waist-high. Broken irrigation pipes stuck from the ground like old bones. Trash had gathered in corners. A faded sign barely hung from one post. Southside Community Garden. Marcus stared. This place? Elijah nodded. Years ago, he had volunteered there occasionally with Grace. Back when the garden had fed dozens of families. Back when children came on Saturdays to learn how vegetables grew. Back when hope looked a little more organized. Now the garden looked forgotten. The shelter director stepped outside as they approached. Mrs. Helen Carter, 70 years old, silver hair, kind eyes, the same woman who had worked there for almost 2 decades. Recognition immediately crossed her face. Elijah Brooks. He smiled. Morning, Helen. The elderly woman laughed. I haven't seen you in years. I know, Her eyes softened. And Grace? The question hung between them. Elijah simply shook his head. Understanding filled her face. I'm sorry. He nodded once. The silence said the rest. A few moments later, she led them through the gate. Marcus looked around. The place felt sad. Not dead, just abandoned. Like something that had waited too long for someone to come back. What happened? Marcus asked. Helen sighed. Funding disappeared. She pointed toward the overgrown beds. Volunteers stopped coming. Another gesture. Water system failed. Then another. Most people moved on. They reached the center of the garden. A rusted bench sat beneath a jacaranda tree. Purple blossoms covered the ground. Elijah stood there for a long moment, listening, watching, remembering. He could almost see Grace walking those paths, talking about possibilities, talking about children, talking about food security and dignity and opportunity, talking about all the things people called unrealistic until someone actually built them. Finally, Helen spoke. What brings you here? Elijah looked around the garden, then at the notebook in his hand, then at Marcus. And for the first time he said the words aloud. I want to bring it back. Helen blinked. What? The garden. The woman stared at him. For several seconds she seemed unsure whether she had heard correctly. Then she laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. Elijah, this place needs more than hope. I know. It needs money. I know. It needs workers. I know. It needs time. That answer made Elijah smile. because time was exactly what he had been thinking about since Richard handed him the envelope. Helen folded her arms. Why now? Elijah looked across the abandoned rows, toward the weeds, toward the broken irrigation lines, toward everything people had stopped believing in. Then he gave the simplest answer he could. Because somebody finally reminded me I still have a choice. The wind moved through the garden. Leaves rustled overhead. Marcus looked at his grandfather. Something had changed. Not just today, maybe forever. And as sunlight spilled across the neglected soil, none of them noticed the small boy watching from the shelter fence. A boy who spent his afternoons helping at the community kitchen. A boy carrying a story about a rare white rose. A story that would soon connect Elijah Brooks to Richard Whitmore in a way neither man could possibly imagine. For now, the boy simply watched, and the future took another quiet step forward. The next morning, Elijah returned to the community garden before sunrise. A thin layer of fog hovered above the ground. The city was still waking up. Streetlights glowed amber against the gray dawn, and the distant rumble of traffic drifted across South Los Angeles like a restless tile. The abandoned garden looked different in the early morning light. Not better, just honest. Every broken fence post, every patch of weeds, every rusted irrigation pipe. Nothing hid in the darkness anymore. Marcus climbed out of the borrowed truck, carrying a shovel over his shoulder. You really think we can bring this place back? Elijah stood quietly for a moment. Then he looked across the neglected rows. I think somebody has to try. That was enough for Marcus. They started working. The first hours were spent clearing trash. Old bottles, broken plastic, discarded boxes, things people had left behind after deciding the place no longer mattered. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through their shirts. Their backs ached. Their hands were dirty. But a small section of the garden had begun to emerge beneath the mess. For the first time in years, actual planting beds could be seen. Mrs. Helen Carter arrived carrying coffee and sandwiches. She stopped when she saw the progress. You two did all this? Marcus grinned. We're just getting started. The old woman shook her head in disbelief. She had seen dozens of people promise to save the garden. Most disappeared within a week. But Elijah wasn't talking. He was working. There was a difference. Around noon, several residents from the shelter wandered outside. Most watched from a distance. A few smiled politely. One elderly woman approached carrying a cane. Her name was Mrs. Jenkins. Elijah remembered her from years ago. She studied the cleared garden beds. Then she asked softly, You really bringing it back? That's the plan. Tears unexpectedly filled her eyes. My husband used to volunteer here. She pointed toward an empty corner. He planted tomatoes right there. For a moment, she simply stood there remembering. Then she slowly lowered herself onto a bench. Without being asked, Marcus brought her a bottle of water. The old woman smiled. Thank you, young man. That afternoon became the first of many small moments. A teenager helped carry soil bags. A single mother brought lemonade. A retired mechanic repaired a broken wheelbarrow. No one was paid. No one was asked. People simply started helping. Because hope can be contagious. By sunset, an entire section of the garden had been cleared. The transformation wasn't dramatic. Not yet. But it was visible. And visible things inspire belief. As Elijah loaded tools into the truck, a small voice called out behind him. Mr. Brooks? He turned. The boy from the fence stood there, maybe 10 years old, thin, curious, holding a basketball beneath one arm. Yes? The boy hesitated. My name's Tyler. Nice to meet you, Tyler. The child glanced around the garden. You really know about plants? Marcus laughed. Trust me, he knows everything. Elijah smiled. Not everything. Tyler looked unconvinced. Then he pointed toward one of the empty beds. My grandma used to grow roses. Did she? The boy nodded. White ones. Something about the way he said it made Elijah pay attention. My grandma said they were special. Lots of roses are special. No. Tyler shook his head. These were different. Elijah crouched slightly. Different how? The boy thought for a moment, then said something unexpected. They belonged to a rich lady. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What? Tyler nodded eagerly. My grandma worked at this huge mansion years ago. He stretched his arms wide. Like really huge. The child searched for the right words. There was a garden with white roses. She always talked about them. Elijah listened quietly. Children often mixed memories with imagination. Still, something about the story caught his attention. What happened to the roses? Tyler shrugged. Grandma said nobody could grow them anymore. The words lingered. Nobody could grow them anymore. A strange feeling moved through Elijah. Not because of the roses, because of memory. Somewhere deep in the back of his mind, he remembered hearing about a rare white rose variety years ago. An unusual one. Difficult to propagate. Extremely delicate. He couldn't place it. Not yet. But the memory was there. Waiting. Tyler smiled. Anyway, I just wanted to know if I could help. Elijah looked at the boy, then at the garden, then back at him. What time do you get out of school? The child's face lit up immediately. 3 days later, Tyler became the youngest volunteer in the garden. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Elijah continued working at Richard Whitmore's estate during the day. The billionaire never mentioned the envelope again. In fact, Richard seemed to have forgotten the entire incident. To him, it had been a passing moment. A joke. A curiosity. Nothing more. Meanwhile, every evening and every weekend belonged to the garden. Slowly, green life returned. Seeds sprouted. Beds expanded. Children appeared after school. Neighbors donated tools. Mrs. Jenkins brought homemade cornbread every Thursday. The shelter began serving vegetables grown on site. For the first time in years, the community garden felt alive. One evening, Marcus sat beside Elijah on the edge of a raised planting bed. The sun was setting behind the city skyline. Orange light stretched across the garden. Children laughed near the water station. Tyler chased a soccer ball between planting rows. Marcus watched everything quietly. Then he asked, "Why does this feel bigger than a garden?" Elijah smiled, because he had been thinking the same thing. It's never just been a garden. What is it then? The older man looked around. At the families, the volunteers, the children, the neighbors who now stopped by simply to talk. It's a place where people remember they matter. Marcus fell silent. A few minutes later, Tyler came running across the garden, out of breath, excited. Mr. Brooks, what is it? The boy held up an old photograph. My grandma found this. The picture was faded and creased. Tyler handed it over. Elijah examined it carefully. A large estate, an elegant garden, and near the center, a row of rare white roses. His eyes narrowed. The image triggered something, a memory from decades earlier, a conversation, a nursery catalog, a name. Then he saw another detail, a woman standing beside the roses, and suddenly he recognized her. Not the woman personally, but the family, the estate, the story. His heartbeat slowed, because he now knew exactly whose roses they were. And for the first time, Elijah realized the forgotten flowers in Tyler's story were connected to Richard Whitmore's family. Very connected. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Because if he was right, those roses weren't just rare. They were nearly extinct. And somewhere in Beverly Hills, a garden was quietly dying. A garden connected to a billionaire who still believed Elijah Brooks was just an old gardener with dirt under his fingernails. Elijah stared at the photograph as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the city. The future had just taken another step, and neither Richard Whitmore nor Elijah Brooks understood where that path would lead. Elijah kept staring at the faded photograph long after the sun had disappeared. The white roses stood in neat rows behind the smiling woman in the picture. Elegant, rare, fragile. For a brief moment, he could almost remember the name of the variety. It sat somewhere in the back of his mind, hidden beneath decades of memories. Not tonight, he thought. Some answers arrived when they were ready. He folded the photograph carefully and handed it back to Tyler. "Take good care of this." The boy nodded. "My grandma says those flowers were worth a fortune." Elijah smiled. "Sometimes the most valuable things aren't the ones people sell." Tyler frowned. "What does that mean?" Elijah glanced around the community garden. Children were laughing near the water station. Volunteers were carrying tools back to the shed. Mrs. Jenkins was waving goodbye. It means some things become valuable because of what they mean to people. The boy seemed to think about that for a moment. Then he tucked the photograph into his backpack. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Brooks." "See you tomorrow." As the garden emptied, Marcus loaded tools into the truck. The city lights began flickering to life beyond the rooftops. For the first time in years, Elijah felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Momentum. Not success. Not victory. Just movement. Forward. The next morning began before dawn. Elijah still reported to Richard Whitmore's estate. He still trimmed hedges, still cared for flower beds, still arrived before anyone else. Nothing on the surface had changed. But inside, everything was different. Richard Whitmore stood on the patio speaking into his phone while Elijah worked near the fountain. The billionaire barely glanced at him. If he noticed anything unusual, he didn't show it. To Richard, Elijah remained exactly what he had always been. The gardener, a reliable employee, nothing more. The envelope had become an old joke, forgotten. But every evening after work, Elijah and Marcus drove farther east, past the crowded neighborhoods, past industrial warehouses, past trucking yards and distribution centers, toward the outskirts of the city, toward possibility. 3 weeks after receiving the money, Elijah found the land. The property sat near the edge of Los Angeles County, where the city slowly surrendered to open space. Dust drifted across empty roads. Power lines stretched across the horizon. The mountains stood blue and distant in the afternoon haze. The land itself wasn't impressive. A little over an acre. Dry. Uneven. Neglected. Most people would have driven past without slowing down. Elijah stopped the truck immediately. "This is it." Marcus looked around. "This?" The teenager sounded disappointed. Elijah climbed out. The wind tugged gently at his shirt. He crouched and scooped up a handful of soil. Then he smiled. Marcus laughed. "You're smiling at dirt. I'm smiling at potential." The teenager rolled his eyes. Same thing, apparently. Elijah rubbed the soil between his fingers. The texture told him things. Moisture retention. Drainage. Mineral balance. Years of experience spoke through his hands. Most people saw dirt. He saw opportunity. The owner of the property arrived 20 minutes later, a retired mechanic named Frank Delaney. Frank drove an aging pickup truck and looked surprised that anyone wanted to rent the land. "You serious about this?" Elijah nodded. "Very." Frank glanced around the empty lot. "Most people take one look and leave. I've worked with worse." That answer made Frank laugh. 2 days later, Elijah signed the lease. The first major step had been taken. The envelope finally opened its purpose. Not spending, building. Over the following weeks, the money began disappearing. Not recklessly, not carelessly, purposefully. Every dollar had a destination. A used greenhouse frame purchased from a closing nursery, water tanks, irrigation supplies, soil amendments, seed trays, specialized containers, rare plant cuttings. Marcus carefully recorded every expense in a notebook. One evening, he looked up from the numbers. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "You still spend money like you're broke." Elijah chuckled. "That's because I've spent most of my life broke." The boy grinned. "Fair point." By the second month, the greenhouse finally stood. It wasn't beautiful. Not yet. The frame showed rust. The plastic covering wasn't perfect. One corner leaned slightly. But when sunlight poured through it for the first time, Elijah stood quietly inside and smiled. Grace would have loved this. That thought stayed with him all afternoon. The nursery still had no name, no sign, no customers, no guarantee of success. But it existed. That alone felt remarkable. The first setback arrived 3 days later. A valve failed during the night. By morning, hundreds of seedlings had dried out. Marcus stared at the damage in disbelief. "We lost almost everything." The young plants drooped beneath the morning sun. Weeks of work ruined. Elijah knelt beside the trays, examining each one carefully. His face revealed almost nothing. Marcus finally exploded. "Aren't you upset?" "Of course. You don't look upset." The older man gently lifted a damaged tray. "Because being upset won't fix it." The answer frustrated Marcus. At least at first. Then Elijah handed him a small plant. "What do you see?" "A dead seedling." Elijah shook his head. "Look closer." Marcus did. A tiny section of green remained near the stem, barely visible. "It isn't dead yet." Slowly the lesson sank in. The next week they replanted, started over, adjusted, improved, moved forward. Again, and again, and again. The months passed. Summer settled across Southern California. The greenhouse grew hotter. The work became harder. Money continued disappearing. Meanwhile, the community garden kept expanding. Volunteers multiplied. Families returned. Children filled the pathways after school. Tyler became one of Elijah's most enthusiastic helpers. One Saturday afternoon, while watering vegetables, Tyler suddenly pointed toward a nearby bed. "Mr. Brooks, what is it?" The boy ran over carrying a newspaper clipping. "My grandma found something else." Elijah unfolded the article. The paper was old. Very old. Nearly 20 years old. The headline described a charity event held at a Beverly Hills estate. The accompanying photograph showed a younger Richard Whitmore standing beside his mother. And behind them, the same white roses. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Then suddenly, the memory returned. Sharp. Complete. The name surfaced from decades ago. He whispered it aloud. Whitmore White. Marcus looked up. "What?" "The roses." Elijah stared at the photograph. The variety is called Whitmore White. The realization settled heavily in his chest, because he remembered something else, too, a difficult truth. Whitmore White roses were nearly impossible to propagate. Most surviving specimens had vanished years ago, which meant if Richard Whitmore's garden was losing them, finding replacements would be almost impossible. The thought lingered as Elijah folded the article, not because he planned to tell Richard, not because he wanted recognition, simply because knowledge had a way of connecting pieces before people understood the picture. That evening, after returning to the nursery, Elijah unlocked a storage cabinet. Deep inside sat several carefully protected cuttings, rare specimens, collected over many years, saved because they were special, forgotten because nobody wanted them. Until now. He stared at them for a very long time. Then he smiled. A slow smile, the kind that appears when a man recognizes possibility. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Inside the greenhouse, rows of young plants stretched toward the fading light. The nursery still had no customers, no income, no reputation. But for the first time, Elijah believed something important. The future wasn't waiting anymore. It was growing. And neither he nor Marcus realized how soon that growth would be tested. Because trouble was already approaching from a direction neither of them expected, and when it arrived, it would threaten everything they had built so far. The first sign appeared on a Tuesday morning in Beverly Hills. A gardener from a luxury landscaping company stood beside the Whitmore Estates Memorial Garden with a clipboard in one hand and frustration written across his face. Richard Whitmore wasn't listening anymore. This was the third consultant in 6 months, the third expert, the third expensive opinion, and none of them had solved the problem. The white roses were dying. Richard stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the flower bed that stretched beneath the old stone statue of his mother. The garden occupied the eastern corner of the estate. Morning sunlight reached it first. His mother had loved that spot. For years, the roses had bloomed brilliantly. Every spring, every summer, every anniversary. Now the leaves curled at the edges. The blooms appeared smaller. Entire branches had begun turning brown. The landscaping consultant adjusted his glasses. "We've tested the soil twice." "And?" Richard asked. "No obvious disease." "What does that mean?" The man hesitated. "It means we still don't know." Richard closed his eyes. That answer had become familiar. Too familiar. His mother had died nearly 10 years earlier. The memorial garden was one of the few things he had preserved exactly as she left it. The roses mattered, more than most people realized. His mother used to spend hours among them, reading books, drinking tea, watching birds move through the hedges. The flowers weren't just plants. They were memories, and memories had become harder to protect than money. The consultant finally gathered his papers. "We can continue monitoring." "No." The word came sharply. The man stopped. Richard looked back toward the roses. "Thank you for your time." The consultant understood the dismissal. 10 minutes later, his truck disappeared down the driveway. Richard remained alone. For a long while, he simply stared at the garden. Then he noticed movement nearby. Elijah Brooks. The old gardener was trimming hedges along the northern wall, working quietly, as always. Richard watched him for a moment, then looked back at the roses. A strange thought crossed his mind. Not because he believed Elijah had the answer, because Elijah had been there longer than anyone else, nearly every day, year after year, watching, learning, observing. Still, Richard dismissed the idea immediately. If professional horticultural consultants couldn't solve the problem, how could a gardener? The thought vanished as quickly as it appeared. By lunchtime, he had forgotten it. Elijah hadn't, not entirely, He had noticed the consultant's truck, the soil samples, the conversations. Most importantly, he had noticed the roses, for months now, maybe longer. He knew something was wrong. Not because of laboratory reports, not because of expensive equipment, because he had watched those roses every day for years. Plants spoke. Most people simply didn't know how to listen. The symptoms were subtle. The leaves, the growth pattern, the color variation, the root stress. He recognized them. But experience had taught him something else. Unrequested advice from invisible people was rarely welcome, so he stayed silent. That evening, after work, he drove to the nursery. The sun hung low over the hills beyond the property. Inside the greenhouse, Marcus was watering trays of young plants. Tyler was there too. The boy had become a regular volunteer. He practically lived at the community garden whenever school wasn't in session. Marcus waved. "You're late." "Busy day." Elijah set down his bag, then walked directly toward a row of carefully protected cuttings near the rear wall. Marcus followed. "You've been checking those every day." "I know." The teenager looked closer. Most of the cuttings appeared ordinary. Except for one group, their leaves carried a slightly different shape, a unique texture, a subtle elegance. Marcus pointed. "The white roses?" Elijah nodded. The memory from the newspaper clipping still lingered. Whitmore white, one of the rarest cultivated roses he had ever encountered. Years ago, before Grace became sick, he had acquired several cuttings through a retired grower in Northern California. At the time, he saved them because Grace loved unusual flowers. He never imagined they might matter again. Yet here they were, alive, growing, waiting. Tyler stepped closer. "My grandma came by today. How's she doing?" The boy smiled. "Good." Then his expression brightened. She remembered something else. Elijah looked up. "What?" "The rich lady. Richard's mother." Tyler didn't know her name, only the stories. Grandma said everybody thought those roses would disappear after she died. Elijah froze. The words settled heavily in the air. Because that was exactly what had happened. Most Whitmore white roses had vanished years ago. Nobody maintained the propagation lines. Nobody preserved them. Nobody cared enough. Except a handful of growers, and one old gardener who had quietly saved several cuttings without realizing their future importance. Marcus noticed the change in Elijah's face. "What are you thinking?" Elijah looked at the young plants, then toward the greenhouse roof glowing gold beneath the evening sun. Finally, he answered, "Sometimes the answer to a problem exists long before the problem appears." Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means preparation often looks useless until the exact moment it becomes necessary." The teenager laughed. "That sounds like something Grandma would have said." A soft smile crossed Elijah's face. "That's because it is." The following weeks brought progress. The community garden expanded again. Families donated tools. A local restaurant began purchasing small quantities of herbs grown by volunteers. Children from nearby schools visited on field trips. Hope continued spreading. But at the nursery, challenges appeared as quickly as successes. One irrigation pump failed. A shipment of specialized containers arrived damaged. Several expensive specimens struggled in the summer heat. Money disappeared faster than expected. Some evenings, Marcus sat with spreadsheets spread across the kitchen table. The numbers worried him. The business wasn't failing, but it wasn't safe either. One mistake could erase months of work. One storm, one breakdown, one unexpected expense. The margin between success and disaster remained painfully thin. Late one evening, Marcus looked up from the paperwork. "You ever get scared?" Elijah was labeling seedlings. Every day. The answer surprised him. You do? Of course, you never show it. Elijah placed another label into a tray. Fear is normal. Then how do you keep going? The older man thought about the question. Then he looked around the greenhouse. At the plants, at the work, at the dream Grace once carried. And finally he answered. Because stopping doesn't remove fear. It only removes possibility. Marcus sat quietly after that. The words stayed with him. Outside, darkness settled across the property. Inside, the greenhouse glowed beneath hanging lights. Rows of growing plants stretched into the shadows. The future remained uncertain. But it was alive. The next morning, trouble finally arrived. Not at the nursery, at the Whitmore estate. Richard stood beside the memorial garden staring at another dead branch. The damage had accelerated, faster than before. Even the house manager looked concerned. What do we do? Richard didn't answer immediately. For the first time, genuine worry crossed his face. Because losing the roses felt like losing another piece of his mother. And there were very few pieces left. Nearby, Elijah quietly trimmed a hedge. He glanced once toward the memorial garden. Only once. But it was enough. The symptoms were unmistakable now. He knew exactly what the problem was. And more importantly, he knew exactly how to fix it. The realization settled heavily inside him. Because helping would require speaking, stepping forward, risking dismissal, risking embarrassment, risking being reminded exactly how little people expected from him. He lowered his eyes and returned to work. Yet one question followed him all day. If he could save something important to another person, did he have a responsibility to try? By the time the sun began setting over Beverly Hills, Elijah still hadn't answered that question. But somewhere deep inside, the answer was already beginning to grow. And very soon, remaining silent would become impossible. The rain arrived 3 days later. Not the gentle kind that drifted across Southern California once or twice a year. This storm came hard. Dark clouds rolled over Beverly Hills before sunrise. Wind rattled the palm trees. Water hammered rooftops and flooded gutters. Elijah arrived at the Whitmore estate at 6 o'clock, as he always did. Rain soaked his jacket before he even reached the service entrance. The security guard nodded. "Morning, Elijah." "Morning." The old gardener stepped inside and immediately noticed something unusual. Several employees stood near the maintenance garage talking in low voices. The house manager, Cynthia Walker, looked tense. Her tablet was tucked beneath one arm. She rarely looked tense. "What happened?" Elijah asked. Cynthia sighed. "The memorial garden." His stomach tightened. "What about it?" "The roses are worse." For a moment, neither spoke. Rain drummed against the roof. Finally, Cynthia shook her head. "Mr. Whitmore is furious." That wasn't surprising. What surprised Elijah was the fear in her voice. Because everyone at the estate understood what the memorial garden meant. The flowers weren't merely expensive landscaping. They were family, memory, loss, love, things money couldn't replace. By mid-morning, Richard Whitmore was walking through the estate like a storm himself. Employees moved carefully around him. Phones rang. Meetings were canceled. Consultants were called. Nothing helped. The roses continued declining. Around noon, Elijah found himself standing near the memorial garden once again. The damage was obvious now. Leaves yellowing, canes weakening, root stress becoming visible even from a distance. He knelt beside one of the plants, careful not to touch it, careful not to draw attention. He already knew the problem. The soil structure had gradually changed over several years. Drainage imbalance, nutrient lockout, not disease, not insects. A slow environmental shift. The kind of thing laboratory reports often missed. The kind of thing experience noticed. He stared at the roots hidden beneath the soil. One simple correction. One carefully designed treatment. 3 months. Maybe 4. The roses could recover. His heart grew heavier, because every day he waited made recovery harder. Yet speaking felt impossible. Not because he lacked confidence, because of what had happened with the envelope. Because of the laughter. Because of the way Richard viewed him. Not maliciously. Worse, dismissively. Invisible people rarely get invited to solve visible problems. The rain intensified. By late afternoon, most outdoor work stopped. Employees retreated indoors. Elijah remained. He hated leaving work unfinished. As darkness approached, he loaded tools into a small utility cart near the service road behind the estate. His boots were covered in mud, his jacket soaked. The storm showed no signs of ending. Across town, Marcus waited in the borrowed pickup truck. The nursery needed attention before nightfall. Several rare specimens required protection from the weather, including the Whitmore white cuttings. Especially the Whitmore white cuttings. Elijah finished locking the equipment shed just after 6. Rainwater streamed down the driveway. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. He began walking toward the employee parking area. Halfway there, he noticed something. One of the drainage channels near the memorial garden had completely clogged. Water pooled dangerously close to the roses. Too much water. Too fast. If left overnight, additional root damage could occur. Elijah stopped, looked toward the main house, looked back toward the drainage channel, then sighed. The decision wasn't complicated. It was simply who he was. He set down his bag, grabbed a shovel, and began clearing debris from the channel. Rain poured down around him. Mud soaked his pants. His hands worked quickly. Leaves, branches, trash, anything blocking the flow. Water gradually began moving again, exactly as intended. He never considered whether anyone would notice. That wasn't why he did it. Kindness had become a habit long ago. Some habits survive regardless of circumstance. 15 minutes later, headlights appeared through the rain. Marcus. The teenager parked near the gate and jogged toward him. You ready? Almost. Marcus looked around. What are you doing? Preventing a bigger problem. The boy smiled. That sounded exactly like his grandfather. Neither realized someone else was watching. From an upstairs office window, Richard Whitmore. The billionaire had returned from a difficult meeting and happened to glance outside. He saw movement near the memorial garden, saw Elijah, saw mud, saw several plant containers nearby, and unfortunately, he saw only part of the story. His frustration was already boiling. His judgment was clouded by weeks of stress, and people often see what they expect to see. Richard expected disappointment. The next thing he noticed made everything worse. Near Elijah's feet sat one of the rare propagation containers he had brought earlier from the nursery for comparison purposes. A container holding a young white rose cutting. Richard's eyes narrowed. What was a rose cutting doing there? A dangerous assumption immediately formed. Downstairs, he grabbed his coat. 5 minutes later, Elijah heard footsteps approaching through the rain. Fast, angry, purposeful. He turned. Richard Whitmore stood several yards away. Cynthia Walker followed behind him. So did one of the security guards. The atmosphere changed instantly. Marcus felt it too. What happened? He whispered. Elijah didn't answer. Richard's face was hard, harder than Elijah had ever seen. What exactly are you doing? The question cut through the rain. Elijah straightened. Clearing the drainage channel. Richard pointed toward the propagation container. What's that? Elijah followed his gaze. Understanding arrived immediately. Not the situation. The misunderstanding. It's a cutting. From where? My nursery. Richard laughed once, coldly, disbelieving, amazing. The word sounded nothing like praise. Elijah remained calm. Mr. Whitmore, I gave you $8,000. The rain seemed quieter suddenly. Everyone heard the sentence. Marcus froze. Cynthia looked uncomfortable. Richard stepped closer. And now I find you taking plant stock from my property? Shock spread through the silence. Marcus immediately spoke. What? That's not... Elijah gently raised a hand. The teenager stopped. The old gardener looked at Richard. Not angry, not defensive, simply hurt. Because this wasn't about the roses. It wasn't about the cutting. It was about what Richard believed of him. After all these years, after every morning, every season, every storm. This was the conclusion he reached. That hurt more than the accusation itself. I didn't take anything. Richard folded his arms. The timing is convenient. The cutting is mine. Can you prove it? The question lingered. Rain fell between them. For a brief moment, Elijah considered explaining everything. The nursery, the community garden, the greenhouse, the Whitmore white roses, all of it. Then he looked at Marcus. The teenager's face was burning with anger, embarrassment, pain. And suddenly, Elijah understood something. This moment wasn't really about him anymore. It was about what Marcus was seeing. A boy watching his grandfather treated like a suspect. A boy learning how the world sometimes judges people before hearing them. Elijah swallowed slowly. Then he said the simplest thing possible. I didn't take anything. Richard stared at him. The silence stretched. Finally, he turned toward the security guard. Escort him off the property. Marcus took a step forward. What? Marcus. Elijah's voice was calm. The teenager looked at him in disbelief. Grandpa, it's okay. No, it's not. The words cracked. Raw, honest, human. Richard looked away first, perhaps because part of him wasn't entirely certain anymore. But anger had momentum, and momentum rarely stops immediately. Elijah quietly picked up his tools, his bag, the container, the soaked jacket. No argument, no scene, no accusation, just dignity. Sometimes dignity is the loudest response available. As they walked toward the gate, Marcus couldn't stop shaking. Rain soaked both of them. The estate lights glowed behind them. The giant mansion stood bright against the darkness, and for the first time in years, Elijah Brooks walked out carrying something heavier than exhaustion. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind that settles deep. The kind that doesn't disappear quickly. Behind them, the gates slowly closed. Ahead of them, rain filled the empty streets. Neither man spoke during the drive home. Neither noticed that the storm was only beginning. Because by morning, the consequences of this night would arrive, and Elijah Brooks would lose far more than a job. The call came at 7:12 the next morning. Elijah was standing inside the greenhouse, inspecting storm damage from the night before. The rain had finally stopped. Gray clouds still hung low over the horizon. Water dripped from the greenhouse frame. Several trays had tipped over during the storm. One section of plastic covering had torn loose. The nursery had survived, but barely. His phone vibrated. The screen displayed a familiar name. Cynthia Walker. For a moment, Elijah simply stared at it. Then he answered, "Good morning." Silence. A long silence. Finally, Cynthia spoke. Her voice sounded tired. "Elijah." He already knew. People often know bad news before hearing it. "I'm sorry." The words confirmed everything. Cynthia continued, "Mr. Whitmore has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." The greenhouse suddenly felt quieter. Not empty, just distant, as though the world had stepped backward. Elijah listened calmly. Cynthia sounded genuinely uncomfortable. "There won't be a dispute over your final pay." "I understand." Another pause. "I tried to explain." "I know." Because he did know. Cynthia wasn't the villain. She never had been. The woman simply worked inside a system where some decisions were made above her. "I'm sorry," she repeated. This time Elijah smiled softly, even though she couldn't see it. "Take care of yourself, Cynthia." The call ended. For a few seconds, he stood motionless. The greenhouse remained silent around him. Rows of plants stretched beneath the pale morning light. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow, nothing was. 31 years of gardening. 9 years at the Whitmore estate. Gone with a phone call. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later. One look at Elijah's face told him something had happened. The teenager climbed from the truck. "What is it?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully finished adjusting a damaged seedling tray. Then another. Then another. Finally, he stood. "They let me go." Marcus froze. The words landed like a punch. "What?" "They terminated my position." The teenager stared, waiting for more, waiting for a correction, waiting for someone to say it wasn't true. Nothing came. Anger arrived first. Hot, immediate, unfiltered. "That's ridiculous." Elijah remained quiet. Marcus stepped forward. "He accused you of stealing." Still silence. He was wrong. Silence again. The teenager's frustration grew. He didn't even ask questions. Finally, Elijah spoke. "No." The simple answer somehow made everything worse. Marcus kicked a loose bucket. It rolled across the greenhouse floor. The sound echoed loudly. "I hate this." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Immediately, regret appeared on his face. Not because he didn't mean them. Because he did. Elijah walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You hate what happened." Marcus looked away. "Same thing." "No." The older man shook his head. "It isn't. The distinction mattered. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday." Life had taught Elijah that bitterness and pain often arrived wearing the same clothes. If you confused them, they could ruin everything. Marcus lowered his head. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the teenager quietly asked, "What do we do now?" That question lingered in the air, because losing the job changed everything. The Whitmore estate had provided stability, predictability, income. Now the nursery carried the entire burden, and the nursery was far from secure. Elijah looked around. The greenhouse, the plants, the equipment, the dream. Then he answered, "We keep going." Marcus laughed bitterly. "That's always your answer, because it's usually the right one." The teenager wanted to argue. Instead, he sat heavily on an overturned bucket. For the first time since the nursery began, fear settled visibly across his face. Not fear for himself, fear for Elijah, fear for their future, fear that all the progress they had made could disappear. That afternoon brought another setback, a major one. When Elijah inspected the irrigation system, he discovered damage from the storm had been worse than expected. A pressure line near the rear section had ruptured. Water had flooded part of the growing area overnight. Several rare specimens were struggling. One tray of specialty cuttings appeared almost beyond recovery. Marcus stared at the damage. "Tell me this isn't happening." Elijah crouched beside the plants. His expression tightened. Not panic, pain. These weren't just plants. They were months of effort, months of hope, months of investment. Carefully built, easily lost. The repair estimate consumed nearly all remaining emergency funds. For the first time since receiving the envelope, Elijah opened the business ledger and felt genuine concern. The numbers weren't good. Not terrible, but not good. Income remained inconsistent. Expenses remained relentless. The margin for error had disappeared. That evening they drove home in silence. Outside the truck windows, Los Angeles glowed beneath wet streets and neon reflections. People hurried along sidewalks carrying umbrellas. Restaurants filled with customers. Traffic crawled through intersections. Life continued, as if nothing had happened. Inside the apartment, reality waited. Bills, rent, insurance. Marcus's college application paperwork sat stacked on the table. One envelope rested on top. University of California. Marcus stared at it. He hadn't opened it yet. The timing felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The teenager sat quietly while Elijah prepared dinner. Simple vegetable soup. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive. The kind of meal they had eaten hundreds of times. After a while, Marcus finally spoke. "What if I don't go?" Elijah turned slowly. "What?" "College." The room became still. Marcus looked down. "What if I just work full-time?" The words hurt more than he expected. Not because of money, because Elijah understood exactly what they meant. The boy was trying to sacrifice his future. For him. No. Marcus looked up. "Grandpa." "No." The answer came stronger this time. Firm, certain. "You worked too hard." "But you worked too hard." Marcus fell silent. Elijah pulled out a chair and sat across from him. For a moment, he looked very tired, older than usual. Yet there was something else, too. Strength. The quiet kind. The kind earned over decades. "When your mother died," Elijah said softly, "I made a promise." Marcus immediately looked away. The subject still hurt. Years later, still hurt. Elijah continued. "I promised I'd help you reach every door she wanted open for you." The teenager blinked rapidly. "You already did." "No." The old man smiled. "Not yet." Outside, rainwater dripped from the fire escape. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement. The city carried on. Inside the small apartment, 2 generations sat together beneath a single kitchen light, trying to hold on, trying not to break. Later that night, after Marcus went to bed, Elijah returned to the greenhouse alone. The drive took 40 minutes. The roads were nearly empty. Clouds drifted across the moon. The nursery stood silent when he arrived. He unlocked the gate and walked between the rows. Everything smelled of wet soil, new growth, possibility, and risk. Especially risk. Near the back corner sat the Whitmore white cuttings, the rare roses, the ones nobody else seemed to have, the ones connected to Richard's mother. the ones that might someday save the memorial garden. Elijah stood in front of them for a very long time. Then he noticed something. One of the cuttings had survived the storm better than all the others. Not only survived, thrived. New growth had appeared overnight. Healthy, strong, unexpected. A small thing, almost insignificant. Yet somehow it stopped him. Because hope often arrives quietly, not as a miracle, not as a rescue, as a reminder. A reminder that life continues trying, even after storms, even after loss, even after humiliation. Elijah smiled for the first time all day, a small smile, but real. He gently touched one of the leaves, then looked across the greenhouse, across the dream Grace once imagined, across everything still unfinished. The job was gone, the money was running low, the future remained uncertain. But something else was true. The nursery was still alive. The community garden was still growing. Marcus still had a future worth fighting for, and Elijah Brooks had not come this far to quit now. What he didn't know was that the next chapter of his life had already begun. While he stood in that greenhouse, someone in another part of Los Angeles was preparing an invitation that would change everything. An invitation neither Elijah nor Richard Whitmore would see coming. 11 months passed. Not quickly, not easily. One day at a time. One challenge at a time. One small victory at a time. The seasons shifted almost unnoticed. Summer faded. Autumn arrived. Then winter. And somewhere between the struggles and the long workdays, the impossible slowly began turning into reality. The community garden became the first sign. What had once been an abandoned lot behind a shelter transformed into something alive. Rows of vegetables stretched beneath the California sun. Tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, herbs. Children raced along the pathways after school. Families carried home fresh produce. Volunteers arrived every weekend. Some came to help. Others came simply because being there made them feel hopeful. Tyler had grown taller. Marcus joked that the kids seemed to grow as fast as the plants. Mrs. Jenkins still brought cornbread every Thursday. Helen Carter still greeted everyone by name. The garden no longer felt forgotten. It felt essential. People talked about it across South Los Angeles. A local newspaper eventually published a small article. Nothing dramatic. Just a story about neighbors rebuilding something together. Elijah never mentioned his name to the reporter. The article appeared anyway. A photograph showed children harvesting vegetables. Marcus stood in the background, smiling. The clipping ended up pinned inside the greenhouse. Grace would have loved that. The nursery changed too. At first, customers came slowly. A restaurant owner purchased herbs. A church ordered decorative plants. A school district requested landscaping advice. Small jobs, modest jobs, enough to survive. Then something unexpected happened. A luxury hotel in Pasadena called. One of their ornamental gardens was struggling. The landscaping company managing the property couldn't identify the issue. Someone had heard about Elijah, the old gardener who could bring dying plants back to life. The hotel gave him a chance. Elijah solved the problem in less than 2 weeks. Word spread. Another property manager called. Then another. Then another. Soon the phone began ringing regularly. Not constantly, but often enough. The nursery finally had momentum. One Friday afternoon, Marcus walked into the greenhouse carrying a clipboard. His expression looked strange, almost amused. "What?" Marcus handed him a document. "You should probably look at this." Elijah adjusted his glasses. The paper contained a financial summary. Revenue, expenses, profit. For a moment he simply stared, then checked the numbers again. Marcus grinned. "I already checked twice." The old man looked up. "We made money." The teenager laughed. "We actually made money. Not a fortune. Not enough to retire. Not enough to buy a mansion. But enough. Enough to prove the dream could survive. Enough to prove Grace's notebook had been right. Enough to prove that knowledge mattered." That night they celebrated with hamburgers from a diner near the freeway. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive. Marcus insisted. Elijah reluctantly agreed. As they sat beneath fluorescent lights and listened to old music playing from a jukebox, Marcus raised a soda cup. "To Grandma." Elijah smiled. "To Grace." They touched cups. A small moment. A perfect one. Across town, Richard Whitmore's year looked very different. The billionaire had barely thought about Elijah. At least not intentionally. Life remained busy. Meetings, investments, travel, the endless movement of wealth. Yet one problem refused to disappear. The memorial garden, the Whitmore white roses, continued declining. Several specimens had died entirely. The surviving plants looked weaker each month. Consultants came and went. Landscape architects proposed replacements. Specialists suggested alternatives. Richard rejected every solution, because none of them preserved what mattered. The roses weren't decorative. They were memory, and memory couldn't simply be replaced. One evening he stood beside the garden after sunset. The stone pathway glowed beneath soft landscape lighting. Wind moved through the trees. The roses stood quiet in the darkness. For a brief moment he remembered his mother, her voice, her laughter. The way she used to kneel beside the flowers despite being wealthy enough to pay others. A strange sadness settled over him. The garden looked tired, like something slowly slipping away. And for reasons he couldn't explain, another memory surfaced. An old gardener standing in the rain. A misunderstanding. An accusation. The memory disappeared almost immediately. Yet it left behind something unexpected. Discomfort. Meanwhile, life kept moving forward for Elijah. The nursery officially received a name. Brooks Restoration and Heritage Gardens. Marcus designed the logo. Tyler voted on the color. Mrs. Jenkins claimed the lettering looked too fancy. Everyone laughed. The sign itself wasn't large, just a simple wooden board near the entrance. Yet when Elijah installed it, he stood quietly for a long time. Because for the first time, the dream had an identity, a real one. A year earlier, he had been trimming hedges for someone else. Now he was building something that belonged to him, not because of luck, not because of magic, because of work. Relentless work. One afternoon, a white SUV pulled into the nursery. A woman stepped out carrying a portfolio. Professional, confident, well-dressed. Her name was Lauren Myers. She introduced herself as coordinator for the California Heritage Landscape Expo. Marcus immediately recognized the event. The largest specialty landscaping exhibition in the state. Hotels, resorts, developers, architects, investors, everyone attended. Lauren smiled. "We've been hearing about you." Elijah looked genuinely confused. "Hearing what?" "The man who revives plants nobody else can save." Marcus nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Elijah rolled his eyes. Lauren continued. "We'd like Brooks Restoration and Heritage Gardens to exhibit." For a moment, nobody spoke. The greenhouse felt suddenly very quiet. The invitation rested on the table between them. Elegant, official, real. Marcus stared at it, then at Elijah, then back at the invitation. "You should say yes." Lauren smiled. "I agree." Elijah looked around the greenhouse, at the plants, at the volunteers working outside, at everything that had grown from a joke disguised as generosity. Finally, he nodded. Okay. The single word changed everything. Preparations began immediately. The following months became a blur. Display materials, marketing brochures, special specimens, demonstration projects. Marcus worked late designing presentations. Tyler distributed flyers around the community garden like a miniature advertising executive. Everyone became involved, especially when they learned what the expo represented. Opportunity. The big kind. The kind capable of changing a business forever. 1 week before the event, Marcus received an envelope in the mail. University of California, Agricultural Sciences Program. His hands trembled as he opened it. Elijah stood beside him, waiting. The silence felt endless. Then Marcus smiled, then laughed, then covered his face, accepted, with scholarship assistance, not full tuition, but enough to make college possible. The moment hit both of them harder than expected, because it wasn't simply a college acceptance. It was proof that all the sacrifices meant something, proof that the future was opening, proof that dreams survived. That evening, after everyone left, Elijah sat alone inside the greenhouse. Sunset painted the plastic walls gold. The Whitmore white roses stood nearby, healthy, thriving, blooming, the most beautiful specimens he had ever grown. He studied them quietly. A year ago, he had received $8,000 as a joke. A year ago, Richard Whitmore expected failure. A year ago, nearly everyone saw only a gardener. Now things looked very different. Still, Elijah felt no anger, no desire for revenge, only gratitude, for grace, for Marcus, for the community, for the chance to build. The next morning, brochures for the Heritage Landscape Expo arrived. Marcus opened the box. Tyler helped unpack it. Helen carried coffee for everyone. Excitement filled the greenhouse. Then Marcus froze. What? The teenager pointed toward one section of the brochure. Featured VIP guest list. Elijah looked. His eyes stopped on a familiar name. Richard Whitmore. Keynote sponsor. Major investor. Expected attendee. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The greenhouse suddenly felt very still, because exactly 1 year after the envelope landed on a garden table in Beverly Hills, their paths were about to cross again, and neither man had any idea what awaited them at the exhibition. The California Heritage Landscape Expo opened on a bright Saturday morning beneath a cloudless Los Angeles sky. Downtown shimmered in the sunlight. Glass towers reflected blue across polished streets. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance to the convention center. Valets moved quickly. Executives carried portfolios. Architects, resort owners, developers, and investors flowed through the massive lobby beneath banners celebrating innovation, sustainability, and landscape design. It was the largest event of its kind on the West Coast. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Brooks was exhibiting there. He arrived before sunrise. Marcus was already unloading display materials. Tyler had insisted on helping and proudly wore an oversized volunteer badge hanging around his neck. Even Helen Carter came. She claimed someone needed to make sure the boys remembered to eat. The booth occupied a prime corner location, not because Elijah had requested it, because the organizers had specifically assigned it. Over the previous year, stories about Brooks Restoration and Heritage Gardens had spread throughout professional landscaping circles. People talked. Property managers talked. Hotel owners talked. Community leaders talked. Results created conversations, and conversations opened doors. The booth itself wasn't flashy. No giant video screens, no expensive decorations, no dramatic lighting. Instead, visitors found something far more powerful. Results, before and after photographs, community garden projects, heritage restoration work, rare plant specimens. And at the center of everything, a display of blooming Whitmore white roses. People stopped immediately. The flowers were breathtaking. Pure white petals, elegant structure, perfect symmetry. Living history. Throughout the morning, crowds gathered. Questions came constantly. Who grew these? Where were they sourced? Were they really authentic Whitmore whites? Could they be purchased? Could they be propagated? Could they be restored to private collections? Elijah answered patiently, the same way he explained gardening to children, without ego, without performance, simply sharing what he knew. Marcus noticed something around noon. Every conversation ended the same way. People left impressed, not by the flowers, by Elijah, because expertise carried a certain weight when paired with humility. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the convention center, Richard Whitmore arrived. His appearance created immediate attention. Investors greeted him. Developers shook his hand. Industry leaders welcomed him. He moved comfortably through the environment. This world was familiar, predictable. His world. The memorial garden remained on his mind. It always did lately. Another rose had died the previous month. The remaining specimens looked weaker than ever. For the first time, he had begun considering the possibility that they might all disappear. The thought bothered him more than he admitted. A coordinator approached. Mr. Whitmore, several specialty restoration exhibits have requested your attention. Richard smiled politely. I'll take a look. The tour began. Landscape innovations, luxury resort installations, sustainable irrigation systems, corporate presentations, most were impressive. None held his attention. Until he reached the restoration section. The coordinator stopped. You should see this one. Richard glanced toward the crowd gathered near a corner display. Something about the booth seemed unusually busy. People weren't simply browsing. They were listening, waiting, engaging, interested, curious. The coordinator smiled. One of the fastest-growing restoration firms in California. Richard barely heard him, because his attention had shifted elsewhere, toward the flowers, white roses. His heartbeat slowed. For a moment he thought he was imagining things. Then he stepped closer. The blooms were unmistakable. Whitmore white. His mother's roses. His eyes narrowed. Impossible. No one had authentic specimens. No one. He moved through the crowd. Closer. Then closer still. Questions flooded his mind. Where had they come from? How had they survived? Who possessed them? The crowd finally parted, and Richard Whitmore stopped walking. Completely. Because standing beside the display was a man he recognized immediately, a man he hadn't seen in almost a year. Elijah Brooks. For several seconds, Richard genuinely believed he must be mistaken. The convention center noise faded. The crowd disappeared. The entire room seemed to narrow. Elijah stood speaking with a hotel owner. Confident, professional, calm, not wearing work clothes, not carrying gardening tools, not trimming hedges. He wore a simple charcoal suit. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. Yet somehow Richard barely recognized him, because context changes perception, and for the first time, he was seeing Elijah outside the role he had assigned him. The old gardener finished his conversation. The hotel owner shook his hand enthusiastically. Then another client approached, and another, and another. Richard watched in stunned silence. Someone beside him noticed. You know him? The question broke his concentration. What? The man smiled. Brooks Restoration. He pointed toward Elijah. Everyone's talking about him. Richard stared. Talking about what? The answer arrived immediately. The restoration projects. Another voice joined. And the community gardens. A third. And those roses. The first man laughed. Especially those roses. Richard looked back toward the display. The Whitmore whites seemed almost unreal, healthier than any specimens remaining at his estate, healthier than they had looked in years. His stomach tightened. A difficult realization began forming, one he wasn't ready to face. Nearby, Marcus spotted him first. The teenager froze. A complicated mix of emotions crossed his face. Tyler followed his gaze. "Who's that?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, then quietly said, "Richard Whitmore." Tyler blinked. "The billionaire?" Marcus nodded. The boy's eyes widened. Neither said another word, because Elijah had just noticed him too. Their eyes met across the crowd. 1 year. Exactly 1 year. A long silence passed. Not spoken. Felt. Neither man moved. Richard saw the gardener he thought he understood. Elijah saw the billionaire who had underestimated him. Neither looked away. Finally, Richard began walking toward the booth. The crowd naturally parted. Not because of wealth, because of curiosity. People sensed something important was happening. Elijah remained calm. His expression revealed nothing. Not anger, not triumph, not resentment. Simply composure. Richard stopped in front of him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard looked toward the roses, the flowers, the evidence, the impossible truth standing directly before him. When he finally found his voice, it came out softer than expected. "Those are Whitmore whites," Elijah nodded. "Yes." Richard stared. His mother had spent years protecting that variety. Experts claimed it was nearly extinct, yet here they were, blooming, thriving, beautiful. The billionaire looked back at Elijah, and for perhaps the first time in his life he truly didn't know what to say. Then his eyes drifted upward, toward the large sign hanging above the exhibit, the sign he had somehow missed during the shock. Bold lettering stretched across the display. Brooks Restoration and Heritage Gardens. Below it sat photographs, projects, clients, awards, partnerships, success, proof, years of quiet work transformed into visible reality. Richard's gaze moved across everything: the community garden, the restoration contracts, the educational programs, the nursery, the accomplishments. Each image felt like another piece of a puzzle he never realized existed. Finally, his eyes returned to Elijah. The gardener, the businessman, the expert, the man he once handed $8,000 as a joke. And in that moment, Richard Whitmore experienced something rare. Not embarrassment, not humiliation, perspective. Because suddenly he understood something. The money hadn't created this. The opportunity hadn't created this. The knowledge had already been there. The skill had already been there. The discipline had already been there. He simply never noticed. The crowd around them grew quieter, waiting, watching, sensing the significance. Then Richard's attention landed on a framed photograph near the roses. A memorial garden design proposal, one that looked strangely familiar. His heart skipped. Because the design wasn't merely similar to his mother's garden. It was a solution, a complete restoration strategy, for the exact problem that had haunted him for a year. His eyes widened, slowly, almost unwillingly. The realization settled over him. The one person capable of saving his mother's roses was standing directly in front of him. And Richard Whitmore suddenly understood that this meeting was not ending the way he expected. In fact, it was only beginning. The noise of the exhibition hall seemed to disappear. Thousands of conversations continued around them. People moved between displays. Investors exchanged business cards. Photographers captured images for industry magazines. Yet inside the small space surrounding the Brooks Restoration booth, everything felt strangely still. Richard Whitmore stared at the roses, then at Elijah, then back at the roses again. The flowers looked healthier than any Whitmore white specimens he had seen in over a decade. Their blooms were full, their color flawless, their structure perfect. Everything his mother's garden had once been. Everything it was no longer. Finally, Richard spoke. How? The question came out quietly. Not as a challenge, not as an accusation. A genuine question. Elijah glanced toward the flowers, the same way most things survive. Richard waited. Attention. The answer settled between them. Simple, direct, uncomfortable. Because attention was exactly what Richard had failed to give. Not just to the roses, to the man standing before him. The billionaire folded his arms, not defensively, thoughtfully. I was told there weren't any viable specimens left. There weren't many. You had them this entire time? Elijah nodded. For years. Richard looked genuinely stunned. Years. The word echoed in his mind. For years the solution had existed, not in some distant laboratory, not in an expensive consulting firm, not across the country, within reach, in the hands of someone he had seen almost every day. The realization carried an unexpected weight. Nearby, Marcus watched silently. Tyler stood beside him. The young boy sensed something important was happening, even if he didn't fully understand it. Around them, visitors continued stopping to admire the display. But nobody interrupted. Instinctively, people gave the two men space. Richard finally looked toward the memorial garden proposal displayed beside the roses. His eyes moved across the drawings. Root rehabilitation, soil correction, nutrient balancing, drainage modifications, long-term preservation strategies. Everything looked detailed, specific, professional, not theoretical. Experienced. He pointed toward the plans. You designed this? Yes. For my garden? Elijah nodded. I started working on the solution months ago. Richard blinked. The answer surprised him. Months ago? Before the exhibition, a strange feeling passed through him. You knew the roses were dying. I did. And you developed a solution. Yes. Richard stared. Then came the question that mattered. Why didn't you tell me? For the first time, silence came from Elijah. Not because he lacked an answer, because he had several. None felt necessary. Eventually, he smiled gently. You weren't asking. The words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Not cruel, not angry. True. Painfully true. Richard looked away. Because suddenly he remembered dozens of moments, years of moments. Times Elijah had spoken and nobody listened. Times he had offered observations and people dismissed them. Times expertise arrived wearing work boots instead of expensive suits. The memory of the rainy night returned. The accusation, the security guard, the dismissal. For the first time, Richard saw the event clearly, not from his perspective, from Elijah's. And the view was uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. Several long seconds passed. Then Richard exhaled slowly. I owe you an apology. The words surprised even him. Marcus immediately looked up. Tyler's eyes widened. People nearby pretended not to listen. Everyone listened anyway. Elijah remained calm. Richard continued. What happened last year? He paused, searching for language. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, words didn't come easily. I was wrong. Silence followed. No dramatic music, no crowd reaction. Just honesty, raw and awkward, exactly as real apologies usually are. Elijah studied him carefully, then nodded once. Not because the pain disappeared, not because everything was fixed, because acknowledgement matters, sometimes more than people realize. Richard looked relieved. Yet another problem remained. The roses, his mother's garden, the reason he had walked into the booth in the first place. Finally, he gestured toward the display. I need your help. The sentence felt strange coming from a billionaire, perhaps because genuine need often does. Elijah listened. My mother's memorial garden is dying. I know. Richard almost laughed. Of course he knew. The old gardener had probably known before anyone else. I want to save it. Elijah nodded. I know. Another silence. Then Richard asked the question. What would it take? Now Marcus looked toward his grandfather. Because this was the moment every story usually turned toward revenge, payback, humiliation, victory. After everything Richard had done, nobody would have blamed Elijah for enjoying the position reversal. Nobody would have blamed him for making the billionaire uncomfortable. Nobody would have blamed him for refusing. Instead, Elijah reached beneath the display table and pulled out a folder, neatly prepared, professional, organized. He handed it across. Richard opened it. Inside was a proposal, a complete restoration contract, detailed assessments, projected timelines, materials, specialized propagation plans, long-term preservation strategies. Every page carried the logo, Brooks Restoration and Heritage Gardens. Richard flipped through the document, then stopped at the final page, the pricing section. His eyebrows rose, not because the price was unreasonable, because it wasn't. The numbers reflected professional value, fair value, the kind of value expertise deserves. No discount, no penalty, no revenge, just professionalism. The realization struck him immediately. Elijah wasn't treating him like an enemy. He was treating him like a client, and somehow that felt more powerful. Richard looked up. You already prepared this? Yes. You expected me to come? Not exactly. The faintest smile crossed Elijah's face. I expected someone would eventually need the solution. Richard laughed softly. The first genuine laugh either of them had shared. Then he looked back at the contract. Another realization arrived. The proposal wasn't merely about saving roses. It represented something much larger. An entire business, an entire future, built from knowledge nobody had bothered to value. Slowly, Richard closed the folder. Then he said something Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Mr. Brooks. The title changed everything, not because of the words themselves, because of who spoke them. Marcus saw it immediately. So did Tyler. So did everyone listening. For the first time, Richard Whitmore wasn't speaking to a gardener. He was speaking to an equal, perhaps even an expert. The respect arrived late, but it arrived. Richard extended his hand. Elijah looked at it, then shook it. The crowd nearby quietly resumed moving. Conversations restarted. The world continued. Yet something important had shifted. not just between two men, inside one of them. Richard glanced once more toward the roses, then toward the photographs of the community garden, the volunteers, the children, the transformation projects. His eyes lingered there longer than expected, because one question had begun forming, a question unrelated to flowers. What happens after the restoration? Elijah looked puzzled. What do you mean? Richard pointed toward the community garden photos. The neighborhood project. Marcus noticed the interest immediately. So did Elijah. Richard continued. How do you keep it funded? The answer was simple. Carefully. The old gardener smiled. The billionaire didn't. Because suddenly he understood something else. The community garden, the scholarship programs, the children, the opportunities. All of it existed on fragile ground. One financial setback could threaten everything. And standing there in the middle of a crowded convention center, Richard Whitmore began considering a possibility neither of them expected. A possibility bigger than restoring roses. Much bigger. But before he said anything, he looked once more at the contract in his hands, at the proposal, at the business, at the man. And he realized the greatest surprise wasn't what Elijah had built, it was how completely he had failed to see it coming. What Richard did not know was that the final decision he would make in the days ahead would transform far more than a memorial garden. It would change lives, entire futures, and it would become the answer to a joke that had started 1 year earlier with an envelope tossed carelessly across a table. 3 weeks after the exhibition, Elijah Brooks drove through the gates of the Whitmore estate once again. The morning sun hung low over Beverly Hills. Golden light spilled across the driveway. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. Almost everything looked exactly as it had a year earlier. The fountains, the stone walkways, the carefully manicured lawns, the massive white mansion. Yet for Elijah, everything felt different. The last time he had left this property, he had walked through those gates carrying disappointment. Today, he returned carrying a signed contract. Not as an employee, as the owner of Brooks Restoration and Heritage Gardens. As a professional hired for his expertise. As a man whose value no longer depended on whether others recognized it. Marcus sat beside him in the truck. Neither spoke much during the drive. There wasn't a need. Some moments become larger than words. At the entrance, the security guard immediately recognized Elijah. A brief look of surprise crossed his face. Then respect. The guard opened the gate and smiled. Good to see you again, Mr. Brooks. Marcus noticed it. So did Elijah. A year ago, he had been simply Elijah. Now he was Mr. Brooks. Not because he had changed, because perception had. The distinction mattered. Inside the estate, Richard Whitmore waited near the memorial garden. No assistants, no consultants, no audience, just Richard. The billionaire stepped forward as Elijah approached. Then he extended his hand. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. The title came naturally this time. No hesitation, no discomfort. Elijah shook his hand. Good morning. For several seconds, they stood beside the struggling roses. The garden looked tired. A few surviving blooms remained. Most of the plants carried signs of stress. Leaves yellowed, branches weakened, growth slowed. Yet Elijah saw something others missed. Potential. Life. Possibility. The same things he had seen in the abandoned community garden. The same things he had seen in the dusty acre outside Los Angeles. The same things he had seen in himself when nobody else bothered looking. He knelt beside one of the roses, carefully examining the soil. then another, then another. Richard watched quietly. Finally, Elijah stood. They can be saved. The billionaire released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You're sure? Elijah nodded. Yes. No dramatic speech, no sales pitch, just confidence earned through decades of work. Over the next several months, restoration began. The process was meticulous, patient, precise. Elijah replaced damaged soil, corrected nutrient imbalances, improved drainage, introduced propagated Whitmore white specimens from the nursery. Marcus helped oversee documentation. The estate staff gradually learned to trust the process. Even Cynthia Walker found herself smiling more often. And something unexpected happened. Richard started visiting the garden regularly. At first, he came to monitor progress. Then he came to ask questions. Eventually, he came simply to listen. For years, he had viewed gardens as decoration. Now he began understanding them as stories. Every plant carried history. Every bloom carried memory. Every season carried lessons. One afternoon, while standing beside a row of recovering roses, Richard asked a question. What made you keep going? Elijah looked up. What do you mean? After everything. The billionaire glanced toward the garden, then toward the mansion, then back at him. The envelope, the accusation, the firing. Most people would have walked away. The old gardener considered the question. A light breeze moved through the roses. For a moment he thought of Grace, the notebook, the greenhouse, the community garden, Marcus, Tyler, everyone who had helped along the way. Then he smiled. I wasn't building my future around what you thought of me. The answer hit Richard harder than expected, because it contained no bitterness, only truth. And truth often carries more power than anger. The restoration continued. Weeks became months. Then one morning in early spring, the first major bloom appeared. A perfect white rose, brilliant against the green leaves. Richard stood beside it in complete silence. The flower looked exactly like the roses his mother once loved. For the first time in years, the memorial garden felt alive again. Not preserved, alive. That evening, Richard sat alone beside the garden long after sunset, thinking, remembering, reflecting. By the time he left, a decision had formed, one larger than the restoration contract, far larger. The following week, he requested a meeting with Elijah. Not at the mansion, at the community garden, South Los Angeles. On a bright Saturday morning, Richard Whitmore stepped through the gate behind Helen Carter's shelter. Children laughed among raised beds. Volunteers harvested vegetables. Families carried baskets home. Life filled every corner. Richard stood quietly, taking it all in. He had donated money before. Millions of dollars. Hospitals, museums, foundations, corporate charity galas. Yet none of it felt like this. None of it felt personal. He watched Tyler teaching younger children how to plant seeds, watched Marcus helping a group of students measure soil conditions, watched elderly neighbors sharing produce, watched people creating something together. And for the first time, he fully understood what Elijah had built. Not a garden, a future. When Elijah joined him near the central pathway, Richard handed him a folder. What is this? Open it. Elijah did. Inside were legal documents, grant agreements, funding commitments, scholarship endowments, long-term partnership contracts. His eyes widened. The first document established permanent annual funding for the community garden. The second created agricultural scholarships for students from working-class neighborhoods across Los Angeles. The third funded educational greenhouse programs for local schools. Elijah slowly looked up. Richard smiled. I wanted to invest in something that grows. For a moment, neither man spoke. The magnitude of the gift settled across the garden. Not because of the money, because of the intention. Richard continued. A year ago, I thought $8,000 would reveal something about you. He glanced toward the children. I was right. Elijah smiled softly. Richard laughed. Just not what I expected. Nearby, Marcus watched from a distance, his eyes filled with emotion, because he understood what this moment meant. Not victory, recognition. The difference mattered. Several months later, the memorial garden exploded with blooms. Hundreds of Whitmore white roses covered the estate, the most beautiful display in over a decade. Industry magazines published articles, landscape organizations gave awards. Brooks Restoration and Heritage Gardens expanded to a second property. The waiting list for restoration projects stretched months ahead. Marcus entered college that fall. Agricultural sciences, exactly as his mother once dreamed. Tyler became one of the first recipients of the new scholarship program. The community garden doubled in size, then doubled again. And through it all, Elijah remained exactly who he had always been. Kind, patient, quiet, grounded. One autumn afternoon, nearly 2 years after the envelope landed on the garden table, dozens of children gathered in the community garden for a planting ceremony. The sun glowed warm above the city. Fresh soil filled the air. New seedlings waited beside prepared beds. Elijah stood among the children holding a small trowel, the same kind he had carried for decades. One little girl looked up and asked, "Mr. Brooks, how did all this happen?" The children turned toward him, waiting. Elijah looked across the garden, toward Marcus, toward Tyler, toward Helen, toward the greenhouse, toward everything that had grown. Then he smiled, a calm smile, a grateful one. And he gave the answer that had been waiting since the beginning. Don't let anyone decide your value based on how they see you today. The children listened carefully. Most good things grow underground, before anybody notices. Silence settled across the garden, the kind of silence people remember. Then the children returned to planting. The future continued, as futures do. Later, after everyone left, Elijah sat alone on a wooden bench beneath the evening sky. The old notebook rested beside him. Grace's notebook. He opened it slowly. For the first time in years, every page no longer felt unfinished. The dream had grown beyond them, beyond the greenhouse, beyond the nursery, beyond the roses. He picked up a pen, then wrote one final sentence beneath Grace's original plans. The seed was never the money. The seed was always the knowledge. Elijah smiled, closed the notebook, and watched the garden bloom. The envelope had been a joke. The garden became the answer. And the answer changed far more than one life. It changed an entire generation. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you would build from the knowledge you already carry inside you. And before you go, I have a simple question for you. Do you believe Elijah deserved what happened to him in the beginning? If your answer is yes, type 1 in the comments. If your answer is no, type 0. That's it. Just a single number. I'm curious to see what everyone thinks. And if you enjoyed this story about quiet strength, second chances, and proving your worth without ever losing your kindness, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story might be even more powerful. There are still so many incredible stories waiting to be told. Stories about overlooked people, unexpected kindness, life-changing twists, and ordinary people who end up changing everything. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself, keep believing in your own value, and I'll see you in the next story.